They left Earth as humans adapted to gravity. They returned, already adapting to something else. The Artemis II crew spent just over a week in deep space, but in that time, their bodies began to change quietly, precisely, scientifically. Blood moved, muscles adjusted, the brain rewired how it understands motion, nothing dramatic on the surface. Yet everything beneath it had already begun shifting. Lycan subscribed to explore how space is reshaping the human body. Far from the thick lower air of Earth, the Artemis II crew moves through a region that offers almost nothing to hold a human body in balance. The spacecraft travels in cislunar space, the broad zone between Earth and the Moon, where there is no breathable air, no weather in the ordinary sense, and no surrounding medium to carry sound or soften light. This outer region is shaped by vacuum, a condition in which matter is so sparse that pressure falls to nearly nothing. In vacuum, exposed liquid does not behave in the familiar way, and unprotected tissue cannot survive. The body depends completely on the sealed world inside the spacecraft, while the space outside remains silent, thin, and severe. The mission leaves Earth on the first day of April in the year 2026 and follows a free return path around the Moon. A route designed so that the geometry of motion and gravity carries the spacecraft back toward Earth without requiring a full orbit around the Moon. At its farthest point, the crew travels roughly 252,756 miles from Earth, moving far beyond low Earth orbit and into the deeper space where Apollo crews once passed. The journey lasts close to 10 days. Across that span, Earth slowly changes in appearance. At first it remains a large sphere marked by cloud bands, oceans, deserts, and the bright edge of daylight. As distance grows, it becomes smaller and more self-contained, less like a landscape and more like a complete object suspended in darkness. That darkness is not empty in the ordinary sense. It contains sunlight, charged particles, dust in trace amounts, and shifting magnetic influence from Earth and the Sun. Still, it does not act like an atmosphere. There is no blue scattering of daylight around the spacecraft because there are too few molecules to bend and spread the shorter wavelengths of light. The sun shines with hard clarity. Lit surfaces can become bright and hot, while shaded surfaces turn cold. The boundary between light and shadow appears sharp because there is little around the vehicle to diffuse light into soft gradients. In cislunar space, illumination becomes a matter of direct exposure. A surface either receives sunlight or it does not. Temperature in this region works differently from temperature near the ground. On Earth, moving air and water carry heat from place to place. In vacuum, heat transfer by convection does not occur because there is no surrounding fluid to flow across a surface. Heat moves mainly by radiation, meaning energy travels as electromagnetic waves, or by conduction through solid materials that touch one another. This is why the outer spacecraft does not simply settle into one moderate temperature. Parts facing the sun can warm strongly, while other areas radiate heat away into space. The environment does not feel hot or cold in a human way because there is no air to touch skin. Yet the thermal demands are exact and constant. Radiation is one of the most important features of this outer region. On Earth, the atmosphere and magnetic field block or reduce much of the harmful radiation that comes from the sun and from beyond the solar system. In cislunar space, that protection becomes weaker. The crew remains outside the densest shelter provided by Earth's lower magnetic surroundings for much of the mission. They are not entirely without planetary influence, but they spend time in a zone where exposure to ionizing radiation rises above what people usually experience on Earth. Ionizing radiation is radiation energetic enough to remove electrons from atoms and molecules. In living tissue, that process can damage cells and genetic material. For a mission of about 10 days, the total exposure is expected to stay within accepted mission limits, especially if no major solar particle event occurs. Observations from past missions and modern measurements indicate that short lunar distance flights can be managed safely with careful planning, though radiation remains one of the main biological concerns in deep space. The Sun is therefore not only a source of light and warmth, it is also a variable force. Most of the time, the crew experiences the steady background conditions of deep space, along with the normal galactic cosmic radiation that crosses the solar system from far outside it. These particles are few in number but highly energetic. At other times, the Sun can release bursts of energetic particles during solar eruptions. Forecasting has improved, but the timing and intensity of these events remain uncertain. Space agencies monitor solar activity closely because the outer environment can change quickly. What is known is that deep space exposes crews more directly to these events than low Earth orbit does. It remains uncertain, for any specific short mission, exactly how solar activity will vary across the flight until the mission is underway. Distance also alters the meaning of communication. Radio signals continue to pass between spacecraft and Earth, but they no longer feel immediate in the way they often do close to home. As Orion moves toward the Moon, signals take longer to travel. The delay is still short by the standards of interplanetary missions, yet it is noticeable enough to remind everyone aboard that the ship has entered a broader arena. Cislunar space is not remote on the scale of Mars, but is far enough that Earth is no longer an enclosing presence. The crew is sustained by Earth, guided by Earth, and watched from Earth, while physically travelling in a region that does not yield easily to human life. The Moon also becomes part of this outer setting, not yet as a place of surface detail, but as a gravitational companion and a pale, stony world that shares the same broad field of motion. The spacecraft does not land. It moves around the far side and returns. In this region, Earth and Moon are linked by gravity into a dynamic system, and Orion passes through that system as a temporary human vessel. The crew inhabits a corridor of motion shaped by physics more than by geography. There are no roads, coastlines, or borders. There are only distances, velocities, lines of sight, and the changing pull of large bodies. By the time the spacecraft reaches the farthest stretch of its path, the outer region has already imposed its basic terms. There is vacuum beyond the hull, strong sunlight without atmospheric filtering, cold shadow, increased radiation exposure, long distance, and the plain fact that the human body does not belong naturally in this place. The mission proceeds because engineering creates a pocket of habitability that moves through an otherwise uninhabitable expanse. Around that moving pocket, cislunar space remains clear, silent, and exact, a realm defined not by drama but by physical conditions that steadily shape every hour of the flight. Between the crew and the outer environment stands the spacecraft itself, a small manufactured habitat whose shell must do the work of an entire planet's surface and lower atmosphere. Orion travels through cislunar space as a pressure vessel joined to service systems, guidance systems, power systems, and thermal control systems. But for the human body, the first reality is simpler. The spacecraft is the only wall between living tissue and vacuum. Its structure keeps air from escaping, limits the passage of heat, reduces some radiation exposure, and maintains an internal environment in which blood can remain liquid. Lungs can exchange gases, and the nervous system can continue its quiet regulation of ordinary life. The shell is not merely transport. It is a substitute boundary for Earth itself. From the outside, the vehicle appears compact when compared with launch systems or large orbital stations. That compactness matters. Every kilogram sent toward the moon demands energy, and every cubic meter of habitable volume must be protected, monitored, and supplied. The crew module forms the central pressurized space where the astronauts live and work. Around it are materials chosen for strength, low mass, thermal performance, and resistance to the repeated stresses of launch. Deep space flight and return through the atmosphere. The pressure hull is built to contain cabin air against the emptiness outside. In engineering terms, a pressure hull is the main sealed structure that resists the force of air pushing outward from within. That force never stops. Even in calm flight, the cabin is always pressing against its own walls because the inside contains gas, and the outside contains almost none. This difference in pressure is one of the most basic facts of human spaceflight. The body is adapted to live at the bottom of an atmosphere. Blood vessels, lungs, eyes, ears, and skin all function within a narrow range of external pressure. If pressure falls too low, gases expand, fluids behave abnormally, and oxygen delivery fails. Orion prevents that collapse by holding the interior at a controlled pressure, and by keeping the composition of the air within a range that supports normal breathing. The shell, therefore, does not only hold people in place, it holds a physical state in place. It preserves an envelope of matter that the body can tolerate. The walls of the spacecraft also manage temperature, though not by simple insulation alone. Heat enters and leaves the structure continuously. Electronics produce heat. Human metabolism produces heat. Sunlight warms exposed surfaces. Shadow cools them. The shell works with a thermal control system to limit these swings. Some materials reflect part of the incoming solar energy. Other layers slow the movement of heat through the structure. Radiators and internal loops move excess heat away from equipment and living spaces. A stable cabin temperature is not an accident of enclosure. It is an active achievement, maintained by constant adjustment. Without that control, a sealed interior would drift away from human comfort and eventually away from safe physiological function. Micrometeoroids and orbital debris shape the protective design as well. Though the main deep space concern is not the dense field of debris associated with some low Earth orbital regions, tiny particles still move through space at very high speed. Even a grain-sized particle can carry significant energy if relative velocity is great enough. The outer layers of a spacecraft are therefore designed not only as skin but also as sacrificial and spacing elements. Some shielding concepts rely on an outer bumper layer that helps break up a particle before it reaches the deeper structure. In practical terms, the vehicle is built with the understanding that space is sparse but not perfectly empty. Protection comes from accepting that rare impacts are possible and preparing the structure to endure them. Radiation protection works within stricter limits. No practical spacecraft shell can block all deep space radiation without becoming too massive to launch efficiently. Instead, the vehicle reduces exposure where it can and organizes the interior so that supplies, equipment, and structure add some extra shielding in certain directions. Materials rich in lighter elements, including hydrogen in water and other compounds, can help reduce the effects of some radiation types. Even so, the shell provides partial protection rather than complete exclusion. That fact gives the spacecraft its particular character. Orion is not a fortress that makes space harmless. It is a carefully engineered refuge that lowers several dangers enough for a short mission to proceed. The shape of the crew module also reflects the demands of return. A deep space habitat must survive not only vacuum but also the violent heating of atmospheric re-entry at the end of the mission. The blunt form of Orion helps spread and manage the heat load during descent. Much of that task falls to the heat shield, a specialized protective layer that absorbs and sheds heat as the spacecraft compresses air at very high speed on the way back to Earth, even during the outward journey. When re-entry is still days away, this return architecture is already part of the spacecraft's identity. The shell has to be both a home in space and a survival system for passage back through the atmosphere. Inside that shell, space is limited. There is no spare landscape, no extra room into which discomfort can disappear. Every surface has more than one purpose. Seats support the body during launch and re-entry. Storage must be arranged so that mass stays balanced and needed items remain reachable. Panels contain controls, displays, and connections for systems that cannot stop working. Handholds and footholds become part of ordinary movement because the body no longer settles onto a floor in the usual way. The shell defines not only survival, but behavior. It teaches the crew how to move, where to rest, how to secure tools, and how to organize daily life within a volume much smaller than the open environments in which human physiology evolved. Sound behaves differently inside this shell than it does outside. Beyond the hull there is vacuum, so sound cannot travel there in the ordinary sense. Inside, the cabin contains air, and sound returns as an intimate part of the environment. Fans, pumps, electronics, airflow, and human activity create a steady acoustic field. The shell keeps these sounds near the crew. In a small habitat, noise control becomes another form of protection because constant high sound levels can disturb sleep, concentration, and stress regulation. The enclosure must therefore support hearing and mental steadiness as much as it supports breathing. The shell also protects through reliability and redundancy. Life support, guidance, power, and communication are designed so that no single ordinary failure immediately becomes fatal. Redundancy means more than one path exists for a needed function. In the context of a deep space mission, this principle is as physiological as it is mechanical. Human survival depends on continued oxygen delivery, carbon dioxide removal, temperature regulation, water availability, and safe return capability. The spacecraft shell is the physical stage on which all those systems are mounted and integrated. Its protective role cannot be separated from theirs. Seen in this way, Orion is less like a vehicle in the terrestrial sense and more like a temporary artificial membrane moving through space. A membrane in biology is a boundary that separates one environment from another while controlling exchange. The spacecraft performs a similar task on a larger scale. It separates the crew from vacuum, allows carefully managed transfer of heat and information, stores air and water, contains waste, and keeps the internal world coherent. Every heartbeat, every breath, every small bodily adjustment depends on this built boundary holding steady. The shell surrounds the crew at all times, close enough to touch from almost anywhere inside, and in that closeness it becomes the material condition of survival. Inside the spacecraft shell, the crew lives within a second environment that is smaller, softer, and more immediate than the structure around it. This environment is the cabin atmosphere. The thin layer of controlled air that surrounds the skin, fills the lungs, carries warmth away from the body, and allows the senses to continue in a familiar way. It is easy to think of air as empty space, but inside Orion it is one of the most actively managed materials on board. It has a chosen composition, a chosen pressure, a chosen humidity range, and a constant movement driven by fans and filters. In a closed spacecraft, air cannot be left alone. It must be made and remade as the crew breathes. The first requirement is oxygen, the gas that supports cellular respiration, the process through which cells use oxygen to release energy from nutrients. The body depends on this process continuously. The brain, heart, kidneys, and muscles all require oxygen-rich blood to remain stable. In an ordinary room on Earth, fresh air is supplied by the vast surrounding atmosphere. In Orion, the oxygen available to the crew exists only because the spacecraft stores it, monitors it, and replaces it as needed. The amount must stay within a narrow, safe range. If oxygen falls too low, the blood carries less of it, and organs begin to lose function. If it rises too high, fire risk increases, and some physiological effects become more likely over time. The cabin atmosphere is therefore balanced not only for biology but also for safety. The second requirement is the removal of carbon dioxide. Each exhaled breath carries carbon dioxide away from metabolism. On Earth, this gas usually disperses into a large volume of air. In a spacecraft, it can accumulate quickly if not removed. Carbon dioxide matters because the body regulates breathing partly through its level in the blood. When it builds up in the cabin, it also rises in the lungs and then in the bloodstream, shifting acid-base balance and making breathing feel laboured. Even moderate increases can contribute to headache, fatigue, reduced concentration, and discomfort. Higher levels can become dangerous. For this reason, the spacecraft uses systems that capture carbon dioxide from the air and prevent it from drifting upward across hours and days. This work is more important in microgravity than it first appears. On Earth, warm exhaled air rises and mixes naturally with surrounding air because gravity drives convection, the movement caused by warmer, less dense air lifting upward, while cooler air sinks. In microgravity, that buoyant flow becomes weak or absent. Exhaled carbon dioxide does not rise away from the face in the same reliable way. Without forced airflow from cabin fans, pockets of exhaled air could linger near the mouth and nose. In such a setting, a person might rebreathe a greater fraction of what has just been exhaled. The cabin atmosphere must therefore be kept in deliberate motion. Fans are not a convenience. They create the circulation that gravity no longer provides. Humidity is another quiet but important part of the cabin air. The body releases water vapor with every breath and through the skin. Cooking is minimal in such a mission, but hygiene, stored materials, and life support systems all add small amounts of moisture to the cabin. If humidity becomes too low, the eyes, throat, and nasal passages can dry and become irritated. If it becomes too high, condensation can form on cooler surfaces, and moisture can encourage microbial growth or damage equipment. The ideal range is neither damp nor dry. It is a carefully moderated middle state that allows breathing passages to stay comfortable while keeping machinery and surfaces stable. The air must also be cleaned of particles and trace contaminants. Human presence generates small debris continuously. Skin sheds cells. Fabrics release fibers. Packaging and equipment can give off trace chemicals. Some compounds arise from cleaning agents, plastics, sealants, or electronics. Others can come from waste handling and daily living. On Earth, contaminants are diluted into a huge atmosphere and can often settle to the ground. In microgravity, particles remain suspended more easily, floating until airflow pulls them toward filters. The cabin atmosphere therefore becomes a circulating medium that carries not only oxygen and carbon dioxide but also dust, droplets, odours, and microscopic fragments. Filtration turns that moving air into a managed stream rather than a passive volume. Air pressure inside the cabin contributes another layer of control. Pressure determines how easily gases move into and out of the lungs and how much oxygen is available at the level of the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where gas exchange occurs. Orion is designed to maintain a pressure that supports ordinary function while fitting operational needs. The body notices this pressure mostly by not needing to notice it. Ears do not ache, lungs do not strain, and circulation proceeds without major disturbance, because the cabin reproduces enough of the familiar physical setting that the body can continue routine regulation. The atmosphere is successful when it becomes almost invisible to awareness. Even so, the crew remains aware of the air through sound and touch. Airflow is constant. Ventilation outlets direct currents across the cabin so that pockets of stagnant air do not form. The skin feels these currents in subtle ways. Loose objects drift in response to them. Hair and droplets respond to them. The airflow shapes the practical geography of the small habitat. A sleeping crew member must be placed so that air continues to move across the face. Equipment that produces heat must sit where the moving air can carry that heat away. The atmosphere is therefore not a still envelope. It is an engineered circulation field arranged around human respiration and machine survival. Odor also behaves differently in a sealed environment. Smells that would vanish quickly in a house or open building can persist and blend in the cabin. This matters not only for comfort but for detection. A burning electrical component, a leaking fluid, or a contaminated surface may reveal itself partly through smell. The crew learns the normal background scent of materials, machinery, cleaned surfaces, and human presence. Changes in that pattern can become meaningful. The air thus serves as a messenger as well as a medium of life. Because the atmosphere is closed and recycled, every breath joins a larger shared system. Oxygen enters lungs, crosses into blood, supports metabolism, and returns as carbon dioxide and water vapor. Those byproducts pass into cabin air, then into life support hardware, and from there into systems that remove, store, or process them. The cycle repeats many times each day. The crew does not breathe the endless air of Earth. They breathe a controlled internal weather, finite in volume and continuously renewed by machines. The atmosphere inside Orion is therefore less like a room and more like a living support loop, steady and carefully tuned, surrounding the astronauts at all moments and entering the body with every quiet breath. Within the controlled air of the cabin, the crew also lives inside a changing pattern of light, time, and separation that presses gently on the body and mind hour after hour. These conditions do not arrive as obvious injury, yet they begin to alter human rhythms from the first days of flight. A person on Earth lives under regular signals from the planet. Daylight brightens gradually, evening dims slowly, weather softens the sky, and the body reads these changes through the eyes, the skin, activity, meals, and social routine. In Orion, many of these cues are reduced, compressed, or replaced. The spacecraft carries its own schedule and its own illumination, while outside the windows Earth and Moon appear not as surrounding worlds, but as distant objects framed by black space. Light is more than visibility. It is one of the main signals that sets the circadian rhythm, the internal daily timing system that helps regulate sleep, alertness, hormone release, body temperature, and metabolism across roughly 24 hours. On Earth, this rhythm is guided strongly by sunlight entering the eyes. Special light-sensitive cells in the retina send timing information to brain regions that help organize the sleep-wake cycle. In space, this system still works, but its signals must be managed carefully because the ordinary environmental pattern is no longer dependable. The crew does not live under a natural sunrise and sunset in the terrestrial sense. The cabin lighting must help provide structure where planetary cues have faded. Inside the spacecraft, artificial light becomes a tool of physiology, brightness, timing, and color tone matter because they can support alertness during work periods and make rest easier during scheduled sleep periods. Light with stronger short-wavelength content, often perceived as cooler or bluer, tends to promote wakefulness. Warmer, dimmer light tends to support winding down. Spaceflight operations use this knowledge in a practical way. The goal is not perfect imitation of Earth, but enough regularity to stabilize the body clock. Even so, the rhythm remains under pressure because the crew's tasks, communication windows, mission events, and the novelty of the environment all shape daily timing. Outside the spacecraft, visual experience adds another layer. Earth can appear bright, self-contained, and distant, while the moon reflects sunlight with a pale, muted brilliance. The contrast between illuminated worlds and the surrounding darkness is strong. Space does not provide a soft visual background. There is no haze, no deep blue atmosphere, and no long twilight. Through a window, the eye can move from intense sunlight to near total blackness over a very small angle. This sharpness can be beautiful, but it also reminds the nervous system that the familiar gradations of Earth are gone. The visual field becomes simplified in one way and more demanding in another. Time itself begins to feel more technical. On Earth, time is often carried by surroundings. Morning has a temperature, a sound, a slant of light. Evening carries dimness, fatigue, and public quiet. In the spacecraft, time is held together by clocks, procedures, work periods, meal periods, exercise periods, and sleep periods. These scheduled events are not merely administrative. They replace some of the missing environmental signals that usually keep body rhythms aligned. The crew follows a mission timeline, often closely, because regular timing helps preserve performance and steadiness. The day becomes something maintained rather than simply lived inside. Distance from Earth changes emotional time as well. The crew remains in communication with mission control. Family messages may be available in planned forms, and the spacecraft is never abandoned to silence. Even so, cislunar flight creates a more distinct sense of removal than low Earth orbit. Earth is visible, but not reachable in any immediate human sense. Its landscapes can no longer be imagined as places just below. Continents, clouds, and oceans gather into one sphere. And this visual unity can have a calming effect while also sharpening awareness of separation. The planet is present to sight, yet absent to touch, smell, weather, and gravity. That contrast becomes part of daily life. Confinement works slowly in such an environment. The cabin is small, highly organized, and full of purpose. Every item has a place because space is limited. There are few private corners. Movement is efficient rather than expansive. The body adapts to this physically by learning economical motions, but the mind also responds. Human attention normally rests and resets partly through variation of environment. A walk across a room, a glance through a window, a change in outdoor air, or the presence of open distance can help regulate mental strain. In Orion, variation must come from tasks, visual views outside, changes in lighting, reading, quiet moments, and interaction among the crew. The habitat remains the same size every hour. Its sameness can become either orderly or tiring depending on the balance of routine and rest. Isolation in this setting does not mean absence of people. Artemis II carries a crew, and shared work is central to mission life. Isolation instead means separation from the wider human world and from the countless unnoticed supports of ordinary living. No one steps outside for fresh air. No one leaves the spacecraft to stand under sky. No local environment offers smell of soil, movement of leaves, distant city light, or rain on a surface. The senses receive a narrower range of inputs. Research from spaceflight and analogous confined environments indicates that reduced sensory variety and constrained space can influence mood, sleep quality, attention, and perceived stress. The exact response differs across individuals, and short missions are generally well tolerated with preparation and support. What is known is that the environment asks the brain to maintain steadiness with fewer natural anchors. The pace of work helps shape this steadiness. A mission to lunar distance involves operational tasks, monitoring, maintenance, observation, exercise, meals, and personal care. Structure gives the mind useful direction. It narrows uncertainty and converts time into manageable segments. Yet structure alone does not remove fatigue. The body still carries its Earth-shaped biology into an artificial cycle. Hormones linked to alertness and rest continue to rise and fall. Attention fluctuates. Emotion moves quietly beneath procedure. The cabin environment therefore becomes both workplace and psychological climate, with light, schedule, noise, confinement, and view all contributing to how the crew feels across the day. In this closed world, one can see how a body begins to change before any deep internal measurement is taken. The astronaut may look calm and fully capable, while underlying rhythms start adjusting to artificial light, constrained space, unusual darkness, and the prolonged absence of normal environmental cues. These changes are not dramatic on the surface. They begin as small shifts in timing, perception, and comfort. The cabin remains breathable, warm, and controlled. Yet life inside it is already teaching the body and mind to live by a different set of signals, quieter than gravity and softer than acceleration, but persistent all the same. Within the ordered light and schedule of the cabin, the most persistent physical condition is weightlessness, or more precisely microgravity, a state in which the spacecraft and the people inside it are falling together so continuously that the usual force of body weight is no longer felt. Gravity has not vanished. Earth, the moon, and the sun still shape the motion of the spacecraft at every moment. What changes is the body's relation to support. On Earth, a person lives under constant loading. Feet press into the ground, joints bear mass, the spine stacks under weight, and muscles quietly contract all day to keep posture steady against the downward pull. In microgravity, that background effort largely disappears. The body enters a condition for which it did not evolve, and from the first hours it begins to respond. The change is immediate in sensation. Objects do not stay where they are left unless they are secured. The body no longer settles into a chair or stands on a floor in the ordinary way. A slight push sends a person gliding across the cabin until a hand catches a surface or a foot loops under a restraint. Movement becomes less about lifting mass and more about controlling momentum. Momentum is the tendency of a moving object to keep moving unless a force changes its path. In the small volume of Orion, this means every action must be gentler and more deliberate than the same action on Earth. A strong push can lead to drifting contact with equipment or another crew member. The environment teaches economy of motion because the body no longer has friction and weight to steady it automatically. At first, the body often interprets this new state as a mismatch between expectation and experience. The brain is accustomed to receiving signals from muscles, joints, skin pressure, and the inner ear that all confirm one fact down exists, and the body is pressing against it. In microgravity, many of those signals weaken or change. The soles of the feet no longer carry the same steady pressure. The back no longer compresses into a seat, except during brief periods of restraint. Neck and trunk muscles are used differently because they are no longer resisting the full downward pull of the head and torso. The body does not become inactive, but the pattern of work changes almost at once. One of the earliest visible effects is a loosening of posture. On Earth, standing and even sitting require continuous muscle tone to stabilize the skeleton. Tone means the low level of ongoing muscle activity that helps maintain position. In space, much of this tonic work fades. Arms may float slightly forward. The spine can lengthen somewhat because the discs between the vertebrae are relieved of part of the compression they usually bear. The chest, shoulders, and hips assume positions that reflect comfort in free floating rather than support against a floor. This posture is not wrong for space. It is an adaptation to a different mechanical world. The body learns quickly that it no longer has to brace itself against collapse. With that reduction in loading comes a broad redistribution of effort. Some muscles, especially those used for posture on Earth, are challenged less. Others gain new tasks related to pulling, stabilizing, and precise movement in confined free fall. The hands become more important as tools of locomotion. A person moves by gripping rails, pushing off surfaces, and controlling rotation with small corrections. Legs are still used, but not in the familiar cycle of standing and walking. Large muscles of the lower body no longer support body weight in the same way, and this altered demand begins influencing tissue even on a short mission. The change is modest over 10 days compared with long stays on a space station, yet it begins from the start. Biology responds not only to total duration but also to immediate differences in mechanical use. The skin also notices the loss of weight. On Earth, pressure points are constant companions. Feet meet ground, hips meet seats, and the side of the body meets a bed. In microgravity, these contact patterns are reduced and intermittent. The absence of pressure can feel relieving at first. There is less compression on joints, less sense of heaviness in the limbs, and less mechanical strain in some areas. At the same time, the loss of ordinary contact cues can leave the body searching for orientation. People often use light hand contact with walls or restraints simply to regain a sense of position. Touch becomes an anchor for navigation and comfort. Everyday tasks reveal the depth of the shift. Eating, cleaning, working at a panel, using tools, storing personal items, and resting all require adjustment because nothing naturally stays on a horizontal surface. The idea of up and down becomes mostly local and chosen rather than fixed by gravity. A wall can serve as a floor, a ceiling can hold storage, and a seated posture exists only when straps or supports define it. The body adapts to this practical fluidity with surprising speed. But the adaptation is active rather than passive. Muscles learn new sequences. Vision and touch begin to collaborate more closely to judge distance and approach. Small motions replace the stronger steps and turns that terrestrial life makes ordinary. Energy use in microgravity also changes in subtle ways. Some routine effort decreases because the body does not have to carry its own weight through standing and walking. Other tasks become awkward and demand concentration because stabilization is harder without a fixed base. The total result on a short mission is not simple rest. Instead, activity is redistributed. The body saves effort in one domain while spending attention and fine motor control in another. This is one reason exercise remains important even on relatively brief flights. Without some deliberate replacement for gravitational loading, the body begins to behave as though certain structures are less necessary. Microgravity also alters how stillness feels. On Earth, lying quietly usually means a surface supports the body. In space, rest can occur while floating in a restrained sleeping position, with no mattress pressing upward in the familiar way. The sensation can feel freeing, but it also removes one of the constant background references by which the nervous system knows the body's shape and position. This absence contributes to the broader adaptation underway. The body is not simply lighter. It is living without the normal dialogue between gravity and support. What makes this condition especially important for Artemis II is that it is present during nearly the entire mission between powered phases and re-entry. Every organ system experiences the consequences in some form. The change begins at the scale of posture and movement, in the outer mechanics of the body, before deeper internal systems show their own adjustments. The crew may appear outwardly composed, moving efficiently within the cabin, but beneath that smooth behavior the body is already rewriting its assumptions. Weight is gone as an everyday guide. Support has become optional, down has become relative, and the human frame has started responding to a world in which standing no longer exists. As the body settles into microgravity, one of the earliest and most measurable internal changes appears in the movement of fluids. On Earth, gravity continuously draws blood and other body fluids downward. This does not mean that fluid simply pools in the feet at all times, because the heart, blood vessels, muscles, and valves work constantly to keep circulation balanced. Still, the downward pull is always present, and the body is built around it, in space. The pull no longer organizes the fluid column in the same way. The moment weightlessness begins, blood and water shift upward from the legs and lower body toward the chest, neck, and head. This is not a flood but a redistribution, a rebalancing of volumes within the closed plumbing of the body. The change can often be seen from the outside. Faces may appear fuller. Veins in the neck may look more prominent. The nose can feel blocked, as if mild congestion has arrived without infection. Legs may look slimmer because they are holding less fluid than usual. Astronauts have often described the sensation as similar to hanging upside down, though not as intense. The comparison is useful because it captures the direction of the shift. What gravity normally keeps drawn lower is now allowed to spread more evenly through the upper body. The result is a body that looks subtly rearranged even before deeper biochemical changes emerge. This fluid shift matters because the human body reads pressure and volume continuously. Special sensors in blood vessels, especially near the neck and chest, detect how stretched the vessel walls are. These sensors help the brain estimate how much blood is filling the central circulation. In microgravity, the upward movement of fluid makes the central region seem more filled than usual. To the regulatory systems of the body, it can appear as though there is too much fluid on board, even though the total amount of fluid has not suddenly increased. This mistaken signal is one of the key drivers of the next stage of adaptation. The body responds by trying to reduce what it interprets as excess volume. The kidneys receive hormonal signals that encourage the loss of water and salt. Urine production may rise, especially early in flight. Over time, blood plasma volume, meaning the liquid component of blood, tends to decrease. This is a rational response according to the information the body's receiving. If the central circulation seems overfilled, reducing fluid makes sense. In space, however, the original signal comes from redistribution rather than true overload. The body is therefore adapting to a changed geometry, not correcting a simple surplus. This process helps explain why astronauts can feel pressure in the head or facial fullness at first, then later operate with a somewhat reduced blood volume. The initial upward shift and the later fluid loss are linked stages of the same adaptation. For a short mission such as Artemis II, these changes are expected to occur to a limited degree compared with longer stays in orbit, but they are still relevant. Even a mission of about 10 days gives the body enough time to begin resetting its fluid regulation. The eyes and head are part of this upper body shift as well. More fluid in the tissues of the face and around the head can alter sensation. The closed, stuffy feeling in the nose is common in microgravity and can affect taste and comfort. Some crew members describe a sense of mild pressure behind the eyes or within the skull, though the exact experience varies. On longer missions, fluid-related changes around the eyes and brain have become an important area of research. Observations indicate that prolonged time in microgravity can be associated with structural and functional changes affecting the eyes and vision in some astronauts. It remains uncertain exactly how all of these processes unfold over different durations and among different individuals. For a short lunar mission, major lasting visual effects are less expected, but the early fluid shift remains part of the same physiological pattern. Circulation in the chest also changes under these new conditions, with more blood returning centrally at first. The heart and large vessels experience a different filling pattern than they do on Earth. The lungs sit within this same shifted field. Fluids that are normally distributed with gravity in mind now occupy the thorax in a new arrangement. This does not usually impair basic breathing in healthy astronauts on a short mission, but it contributes to the sense that the upper body has become the new center of internal loading. The body's no longer stacked vertically in the old sense. Its fluid spaces have been reshaped by the absence of a lower end and an upper end in practical gravitational terms. The skin and soft tissues reflect this change quietly. Rings may fit differently. The face in a photograph may look broader or puffier. Lower limbs may appear leaner without any true loss of muscle over the first brief period. This is one reason the phrase "bodies already altered by space" is scientifically meaningful even very early in a mission. The alterations are real, measurable, and rooted in basic fluid physics. They do not require weeks of flight to begin. They start when gravity's organizing pull is removed. Yet the body does not simply surrender to disorder. It begins building a new equilibrium. Hormones involved in fluid balance, salt regulation, and vascular tone adjust in response to the altered signals. Drinking patterns, food intake, exercise, and cabin conditions all influence the details. The crew continues to function because the human organism is flexible within limits. The discomfort of facial fullness or nasal congestion often eases as adaptation progresses. The new internal map becomes less strange. What first feels like displacement becomes temporarily normal. Still, this new normal is specific to space and carries a hidden cost. By reducing fluid volume and reshaping circulation for microgravity, the body may become less prepared for a sudden return to gravity later. A system that has adjusted to life without downward pull can struggle when that pull reappears. The seeds of that later challenge are planted here in the early fluid shift, while the crew is still moving calmly through the cabin and outwardly appearing well. In this stage of the mission, the changes remain largely within the soft and mobile parts of the body. Water, plasma, tissue fluid, and vascular pressures are the main actors. Nothing dramatic announces their motion. No single moment marks the end of Earth pattern circulation and the beginning of space pattern circulation. Instead, the shift unfolds quietly through sensations in the face, signals in the vessels, actions of the kidneys, and a gradual rewriting of volume control. The body is not yet deep within its inner adaptations, but it has already begun to redistribute one of its most essential materials, and in doing so it starts to become a little less terrestrial. As fluid shifts toward the chest and head, the heart and blood vessels begin their own adjustment to life without gravity, on Earth. The cardiovascular system works within a tall column. Blood must be pushed upward to the brain and allowed to return from the legs against the constant pull of gravity. Muscles in the calves help squeeze venous blood upward during walking. Valves in the veins help keep that blood from falling back down. Arteries and veins throughout the body maintain a finely tuned degree of tension so that pressure stays high enough where it is needed and not excessively high where it is not. In space, much of this vertical challenge is removed. The heart no longer has to work against the same downward gradient, and the vessels no longer distribute blood across a body that is mechanically divided into upper and lower regions by weight. At first, this can make central circulation seem easier. More blood returns toward the chest, and the heart fills in a different pattern than it does under gravity. Cardiac filling refers to the amount of blood entering the heart before it contracts. With the early upward fluid shift, that filling may rise for a time, especially in the chambers on the right side that receive blood returning from the body. The heart responds beat by beat, adjusting output according to how much blood stretches its walls. This basic property, in which a fuller heart can pump more forcefully within normal limits, helps keep circulation steady during changing conditions. In space, it supports the first stage of adaptation by handling the rearranged fluid distribution without collapse of blood flow. Yet this apparently favourable condition does not remain simple. The body soon interprets the increased central volume as a signal that too much fluid is present. Hormonal responses reduce plasma volume, and the circulation settles into a new state. With less total circulating fluid than before, the heart eventually works with a slightly smaller filling volume than it did on Earth. Over time, some measures of cardiac workload may decrease because moving blood in weightlessness does not require the same constant effort to counter gravity. On long missions, the heart can undergo mild deconditioning, meaning it becomes less trained for standing and pumping against gravity. On a mission lasting about 10 days, this effect is expected to begin but remain limited. Even so, the process starts early enough to matter. Heart rate, blood pressure, and vessel tone all take part in this recalibration. Vessel tone means the degree of constriction or relaxation in the muscular walls of blood vessels. On Earth, these vessels are always adjusting in response to posture. Standing up causes blood to shift downward, and the body answers with constriction in certain vascular beds and a rise in heart rate to preserve blood flow to the brain. In microgravity, such upright challenges vanish. The nervous system no longer rehearses the same postural responses many times each day, because there is no true standing position and no lower pooling of blood in the ordinary sense. The reflex pathways remain intact, but they are used differently. This altered use is one reason the cardiovascular system can become less ready for the return of gravity. The veins are particularly important in this story because they are not rigid tubes. They are flexible reservoirs that hold much of the blood volume at any given time. In the legs on Earth, veins are distensible, meaning they can expand and store blood when gravity draws fluid downward. During spaceflight, those lower body veins are relieved of that chronic burden. Blood redistributes away from them, and the vessels adapt to a changed pattern of filling. The muscles of the legs also become less active in supporting venous return because walking and standing are absent. A system that usually depends on gravity, movement, and vascular reflexes becomes quieter. The quietness is efficient for space, but it can reduce readiness for Earth. Arteries also experience a different environment. On Earth, arterial pressure has to maintain a pressure head sufficient to perfuse the brain above the heart when a person is upright. In microgravity, the hydrostatic gradient, meaning the pressure difference created by the weight of fluid in a gravitational field, largely disappears. Blood pressure becomes more uniform from head to foot than it is on Earth. This changes how pressure sensors in the body interpret the circulation. The brain and vessels are no longer receiving the same pattern of information from posture, effort, and gravity-driven pressure shifts. The cardiovascular system begins to accept this flatter internal landscape as normal. Exercise remains important because it gives the heart and vessels a substitute challenge. Even on shorter missions, structured physical activity helps preserve blood volume, vessel responsiveness, and cardiac conditioning. The point is not only to strengthen muscles, it is also to remind the circulation that it must continue adapting actively, rather than drifting into a lower demand state. Exercise in space does not fully replace gravity, but it helps maintain the dynamic range of the cardiovascular system. The heart benefits from periods of increased workload, while vessels benefit from changing flow demands and pressure responses. In a mission such as Artemis II, where duration is relatively brief, these countermeasures support function across the flight and help prepare the crew for return. The sensation of the heartbeat may change subjectively as well. Some astronauts become more aware of pulse in the head or neck early in flight, partly because of the fluid shift and partly because the body is learning a new internal geometry. This awareness does not necessarily indicate disease. It reflects the fact that circulation has moved closer, in a sense, to the upper body and face. As adaptation continues, this sensation often becomes less noticeable. The body is remarkably capable of making the unusual feel ordinary when exposure continues. Researchers have studied cardiovascular responses in astronauts for decades, and some patterns are well established. Blood volume tends to decrease during spaceflight. Orthostatic tolerance, meaning the ability to remain stable when upright under gravity, can decline. Heart rate and blood pressure responses to standing may be less effective immediately after landing. At the same time, individuals vary. Fitness, hydration, mission duration, sex, age, and specific countermeasures all influence the outcome. Observations indicate clear common trends, while the exact degree of change differs across crews and missions. It remains uncertain in any single case how strongly a short lunar distance mission will affect each astronaut's cardiovascular recovery profile until post-flight measurements are made. Within the mission itself, however, the heart continues its work quietly. It contracts, relaxes, fills, and empties in a body whose internal fluids have been rearranged and whose usual gravitational burdens have been lifted. The blood vessels narrow and widen under nervous and hormonal control, but now they do so in a system without upright posture. The result is not failure but reorganization. The cardiovascular system becomes temporarily specialized for spaceflight. It pumps in a body that floats, regulates a circulation that no longer stacks from feet to head, and maintains life in a habitat where the ordinary challenges of gravity have been exchanged for a subtler task, preserving readiness in the absence of the very force for which the system evolved. Within this reorganized circulation, breathing continues almost automatically, yet the chemistry behind each breath is working under altered conditions. The lungs do not stop functioning in microgravity. Air still enters, oxygen still crosses into blood, carbon dioxide still leaves it, and the chest still rises and falls through the action of respiratory muscles. Even so, The mechanics and distribution of this exchange become less like those of Earth. On the ground, gravity influences how blood and air are distributed through the lungs. Some regions receive slightly different shares of airflow or blood flow depending on posture. In space, that gravitational pattern weakens and the lungs begin operating in a more uniform internal field. This does not make breathing simpler in every respect, but it changes the balance of forces that shape gas exchange. Gas exchange takes place in the alveoli, the tiny air sacs at the ends of the branching airways. Their walls are extremely thin, allowing oxygen to move from inhaled air into the blood, while carbon dioxide moves in the opposite direction. This movement depends on partial pressure, meaning the share of total gas pressure contributed by a given gas. Oxygen moves from where its partial pressure is higher to where it is lower, and carbon dioxide does the same in reverse. The process is continuous and usually efficient in healthy astronauts. In space, the basic physical principle remains unchanged, but the surrounding distribution of air and blood becomes less affected by vertical position. The lungs no longer have a top and bottom in the same physiological sense that they do on Earth. On Earth, gravity slightly increases blood flow to the lower parts of the lungs when a person is upright. Airflow also has gradients, though not always in identical patterns. These uneven distributions are normal and are part of how lungs work within a gravitational field. In microgravity, the gradients become more even. Studies from human spaceflight indicate that ventilation, meaning the movement of air in and out of the lungs, and perfusion, meaning blood flow through the lung capillaries, are distributed more uniformly in weightlessness than they are on Earth. This can preserve efficient gas exchange, and in some respects it can even reduce certain mismatches between airflow and blood flow. The lungs are therefore not simply impaired by space. They are placed into a different operating geometry. The chest wall also behaves differently. On Earth, the abdominal organs and the weight of the chest itself exert mechanical effects on the diaphragm and rib cage depending on posture. The diaphragm is the broad muscle beneath the lungs that contracts to draw air inward. In microgravity, these weight-related influences are altered. The abdominal contents are no longer pulled downward in the same way, and the shape of the chest can shift subtly because the body is no longer bearing its own mass. This changes resting lung volumes and the effort pattern of breathing. The differences are usually well tolerated in healthy crew members, but they help explain why respiration in space is not identical to respiration on Earth, even when a person feels comfortable. Air movement within the cabin remains closely linked to breathing because the surrounding atmosphere is closed and mechanically circulated. As already established, exhaled carbon dioxide does not naturally rise away from the face in microgravity. It can remain nearby unless ventilation carries it away. This makes cabin airflow directly relevant to respiratory comfort and chemistry. If air circulation is poor around a crew member, rebreathed carbon dioxide can increase. That increase may be small, but carbon dioxide has powerful physiological effects even at levels that fall short of outright danger. It stimulates breathing, affects acid-base balance, and can contribute to headache, a sense of air hunger, reduced cognitive clarity, and disturbed sleep. Spacecraft therefore manage not only oxygen supply but the fine control of carbon dioxide exposure. The blood acts as the moving link between lungs and tissues. Oxygen entering through the alveoli binds mainly to hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein in red blood cells. Carbon dioxide returns partly dissolved in plasma, partly bound to proteins, and largely in a converted chemical form called bicarbonate. This chemical system helps stabilize acidity in the blood. Acidity matters because enzymes, nerve cells, muscle cells, and organ systems all depend on a narrow range of pH, the measure that reflects how acidic or alkaline a solution is. Breathing and blood chemistry are therefore deeply connected. Changes in carbon dioxide are not just changes in a waste gas. They are changes in the chemical environment of the whole body. Microgravity does not remove this regulation, but it places it into a different context. The fluid shift toward the chest can alter central blood volume and the relationship between circulation and breathing. The lungs sit within a thorax that has become part of the new fluid center of the body. Respiratory control systems continue to respond to carbon dioxide, oxygen, and acidity. Yet they do so in an organism whose internal pressures have been redistributed. This helps explain why astronauts may notice breathing differently, even when tests remain within normal ranges. The body is using familiar control loops in an unfamiliar setting. Exercise inside the spacecraft adds another layer. During physical activity, tissues require more oxygen and produce more carbon dioxide. The lungs and circulation must increase their performance together. In space, exercise is essential for broader physiological reasons, but it also serves as a test and maintenance tool for cardiorespiratory coordination. The crew breathes harder, the heart pumps faster, and the chemical exchange between air and blood becomes more demanding. Observations from space missions show that healthy astronauts can sustain exercise in microgravity. Although performance and perception may differ from Earth, mechanical support, body restraint, equipment design, and fluid distribution all shape how strenuous activity feels. The respiratory system remains capable, but it is participating in a body that no longer braces itself against gravity. Odors, dryness, and mild nasal congestion can also influence perceived breathing. When the face carries more fluid and the nose feels blocked, airflow through the upper airways may seem less open, even if oxygen exchange in the lungs remains adequate. Taste and smell can become duller for some crew members, partly because nasal passages are less clear. These are not central failures of the lungs, but they show how respiratory experience includes more than alveoli and blood gases. The felt quality of breathing depends on the whole airway and on the surrounding atmosphere. The closed cabin makes respiratory chemistry collective as well as individual. Each breath changes the shared air. Carbon dioxide removed from one astronaut's lungs enters the spacecraft atmosphere and must be cleared for the benefit of all. Oxygen consumed by one body must be replenished within the same finite system. In this sense, respiration in Orion is not merely personal physiology. It is part of a loop linking lungs, blood, machines, stored gases, filters, fans, and the metabolic needs of the entire crew. The body breathes, but the spacecraft must keep the chemistry of breathing possible. By this stage of the mission, the lungs are functioning within a body already altered by weightlessness and fluid redistribution. Breathing remains steady, blood continues its exchange, oxygen reaches tissues, carbon dioxide leaves them, and the chemistry of life carries on without drama. Yet the conditions are no longer purely Earth-like. Gas exchange is occurring in a more uniform lung, within a chest that has become a new fluid center. Inside a cabin where air must be actively moved and continuously cleaned, the process remains quiet and efficient, but its setting has changed completely, and the body has already adapted enough to make that change seem ordinary. As the body continues living without weight, the large muscles that usually support posture begin to change their role. On Earth, a great deal of muscle activity is quiet and constant. Even when a person seems still, the calves, thighs, hips, back, neck, and abdomen are working to resist collapse under gravity. Postural muscles are the muscles that help maintain the body's position against that pull. They do not always create obvious movement, yet they are active throughout standing, walking, sitting upright, and even making small adjustments while reaching or turning. In microgravity, much of this continuous demand falls away. The body no longer needs to hold itself upright because upright has lost its old meaning. From that moment, the muscular system begins adapting to a different pattern of necessity. The first change is not weakness in the ordinary sense. It is altered use. Muscles that once spent many hours each day bearing weight now spend less time under sustained load. The calves do not push blood upward through repeated stepping in the same way. The thighs and hips do not support body mass through a cycle of standing and walking. The deep muscles of the spine no longer oppose the same constant compression. The trunk still stabilizes the body during movement. The arms still guide tasks. And the hands become especially active. But the background demand that shapes ordinary terrestrial muscle life has been reduced. A system built for resistance and support begins moving toward one built more for positioning and control. This can be seen in the way astronauts move through the cabin. Motion becomes hand-led. A person reaches for a rail, pulls gently, rotates with a touch, and stops with another touch. The lower body remains present, but it is no longer the primary means of transport. Legs may hook under restraints or brace lightly during certain tasks, but they do not carry the full body from one place to another. This matters because muscle tissue responds directly to use. A muscle that is loaded repeatedly tends to preserve or increase its capacity. A muscle that is used less intensely, or in a narrower range, begins to adapt downward. The process is called deconditioning, meaning a loss of performance or capacity when usual demands are reduced. In a mission lasting about 10 days, the changes in muscle size and strength are usually modest compared with those seen after months in orbit, but they are not absent. The body begins adjusting within days. The first stage can include changes in muscle tone, coordination, and recruitment, which means the pattern by which the nervous system activates muscle fibers. A muscle may still be present in roughly the same size while already being used in a different way. This is important because not all physiological change is visible from the outside. A person may appear capable and controlled while the internal logic of movement is already being rewritten. The muscles most affected tend to be those most closely tied to standing and walking under gravity. These include the calf muscles, the front and back muscles of the thigh, the hip extensors, and the muscles that stabilize the lower back. On Earth, they act against body weight and against the forces generated with each step. In microgravity, that repeated loading no longer arrives naturally. The body does not need to rise from a chair, arrest a fall, or keep the head aligned over the pelvis during walking. As a result, some of these muscles become less active unless exercise is used to replace the missing demand. The decline begins as a response to changed circumstances, not as a failure. The body is economical. It tends to preserve what is needed and reduce what seems temporarily unnecessary. Muscle fibers themselves can respond differently depending on their usual role. Some fibers are better suited for sustained, lower force activity, while others are better suited for shorter bursts of greater force. Postural work on Earth often relies heavily on endurance-oriented fibers because standing and stabilizing continue for long periods. When weightlessness removes much of that need, the balance of activity across fiber types can begin to shift over longer durations. This can contribute to losses in endurance and strength, especially in the lower limbs. On a short mission, these changes are at an early stage, but the process has already begun. Observations from spaceflight indicate that muscular adaptation starts quickly. though the extent depends on duration, exercise, workload, and individual physiology. The spine deserves careful attention in this region of the body. Without gravity compressing the vertebral column in the usual way, the spine can lengthen somewhat, and the surrounding muscles work under altered conditions. This can relieve some forms of downward loading, but it can also contribute to discomfort. Back pain in early spaceflight has been reported by some astronauts, likely because tissues around the spine are experiencing changed geometry, changed tension, and changed fluid distribution all at once. The muscles that stabilize the trunk are still active, but they are learning to function without the constant axial load, meaning the load that normally presses downward along the length of the body. Even in a short mission, this new condition can change how the torso feels and moves. Fine motor control often becomes more important as gross weight bearing becomes less important. The crew handles tools, controls, straps, food packets, hygiene items, and scientific equipment in a free-floating environment where small unintended motions can matter. Shoulder and forearm muscles may therefore be used frequently, though in patterns different from terrestrial work. The hands become central to anchoring and repositioning the body. This does not fully compensate for the lost loading in the legs and trunk, but it shows that muscle adaptation in space is not simply decline everywhere, it is redistribution. Some functions are reduced, others are intensified. The overall muscular map becomes organized around the needs of a floating body in a confined habitat. Exercise counteracts part of this shift. Resistance and aerobic exercise in space are used to provide an artificial form of mechanical demand. Muscles need tension to maintain themselves, and bones need that tension as part of their own health. Even on a shorter deep space mission, exercise helps preserve circulation, coordination, and muscle engagement. It reminds the body that the lower limbs and trunk are still required, yet exercise is a supplement, not a full replacement for the countless loading events that Earth provides for free. On the ground, every step is a form of resistance training at low intensity. In space, that endless stream of ordinary loading is absent unless deliberately recreated. Posture itself becomes more fluid. On Earth, posture is often judged by alignment against vertical. In Orion, posture is defined by comfort, task, and restraint. A crew member may work facing any wall. Knees may be lightly bent, arms floating, head tilted in ways that would seem unusual on the ground. These positions are not poor posture in space. They are practical responses to a world without up or down. The muscles accommodate this by supporting the body in a less hierarchical way. There is less need to stack one segment over another. Instead, the body folds and unfolds in relation to handholds, equipment, and the direction of movement. By this point in the mission, the muscular system has not yet undergone the deeper atrophy or tissue wasting associated with much longer exposure, but it is already living by a different rule. The body has stopped receiving continuous proof that it must carry itself. Support has become intermittent. The legs are still present but less burdened. The trunk is still active but less compressed, and the hands have become more essential than feet for ordinary travel. What changes first is use, then tone, then capacity if exposure continues. The Artemis II crew, even within days, returns with muscles that have already begun this process of adaptation, shaped not by injury, but by the simple absence of weight. Beneath the muscles that have begun changing their workload, the bones continue their own quieter conversation with gravity. Bone is often imagined as fixed and inert, but it is living tissue, constantly renewed through a balance of breakdown and rebuilding. This process is called remodeling. Old bone is removed in small amounts, and new bone is laid down in response to mechanical stress, metabolic need, and hormonal regulation. On Earth, ordinary life supplies a great deal of this stress. Standing, walking, climbing, lifting, and even subtle postural adjustments send force through the skeleton every day. Bones of the legs, hips, and spine are especially shaped by this continuous loading. In microgravity, much of that mechanical message falls silent, and the skeleton begins adapting to its absence. The first thing to understand is that bone does not wait for obvious injury before it responds. It is always sensing load through its cells and structure. When force passes through a bone, the tissue bends very slightly at the microscopic level. Bone cells can detect this strain and use it as information about how much strength is needed in a given region. If the load remains regular, remodeling tends to preserve or strengthen bone in the appropriate pattern. If the load decreases for long enough, the body begins to reduce investment in maintaining that tissue at its previous level. This is efficient from a biological point of view. A structure that seems less necessary may receive less maintenance. In space, this principle begins operating almost at once, even if the full consequences take longer to appear. The bones most affected are usually those that bear body weight on Earth. The hips, femurs, lower spine, and lower legs normally support mass against gravity. Each step sends force up through the skeleton. Each change of posture shifts pressure through joints and vertebrae. In microgravity, those repeated impacts and compressions largely disappear. The astronaut may still use the legs in restrained exercise, may still push gently from one surface to another, and may still tension the muscles of the trunk during work, but the endless pattern of ordinary loading is gone. The skeleton is therefore receiving a change signal from the outer mechanics of the body. It is being told, indirectly, that less support is required. At the cellular level, bone remodeling depends on different kinds of cells with different tasks. Some cells remove mineralized tissue, while others build new matrix and help mineralize it. The matrix is the structural framework of the bone, largely made of collagen and minerals such as calcium and phosphorus. These cellular teams are regulated by hormones, local chemical signals, nutrition, and physical loading. In space, the reduced load shifts the balance toward more resorption, meaning breakdown, relative to formation. Over longer missions, this leads to measurable loss of bone mineral density in some regions. For a mission of about 10 days, large losses are not expected, but the direction of change can already be underway. The bone system, like muscle, begins adapting early, even when measurable outcomes remain small. This early response can also affect mineral balance in the blood and urine. Bone stores a large share of the body's calcium. When bone resorption increases, some of that calcium enters circulation and can eventually be excreted. Spaceflight studies, particularly from longer missions, have shown increased calcium excretion in urine. This matters because it reflects the skeleton's altered balance and may contribute to kidney stone risk over longer durations. On a short lunar mission, the increase is expected to be limited, but the same underlying mechanism is relevant. The body is beginning to treat its mineral reserves differently because the skeleton is no longer being loaded in its usual way. The spine is a special case in this region. Earlier, the muscles and discs of the back respond to the loss of axial loading by changing tension and spacing. Bone in the vertebrae is part of that same system. Vertebrae normally experience compressive forces from body weight, movement, and muscle action. In microgravity, these forces shift significantly. Some structures are relieved of pressure, which can feel physically different, while the long-term mechanical signal to preserve bone mass in the usual pattern becomes weaker. At the same time, the spine is still used in rotation, stabilization, and restraint-based motion. The result is not complete inactivity, but a more selective and less Earth-like pattern of skeletal demand. Nutrition becomes important here because bone remodeling depends on available materials as well as on mechanical force. Calcium, phosphorus, protein, vitamin D, and overall energy intake all contribute to bone health. In space, food is carefully planned to support the crew, but nutrition alone cannot fully replace the signal of weight-bearing. A skeleton needs matter, but it also needs instruction. On Earth, gravity provides that instruction constantly. In Orion, exercise and restraint systems can imitate part of it, yet they do so for limited periods rather than continuously. The difference between intermittent loading and all-day loading is one reason spaceflight bone loss remains an important concern for long missions. Hormones also shape the response. Bone metabolism is linked to endocrine signals involving parathyroid hormone, vitamin D metabolism, sex hormones, and other regulators of calcium balance. Stress, sleep disruption, exercise, and altered nutrition can all influence this hormonal environment. Spaceflight, therefore, does not affect bone in isolation. The skeleton is part of a broader network. As the body clock shifts, fluids redistribute, muscles change use, and metabolism adjusts. Bone receives these signals as part of a whole-body transition. What happens in the skeleton is tied to what is happening in the circulation, kidneys, and hormonal systems that quietly coordinate internal stability. Even before measurable bone loss becomes significant, the altered loading pattern has practical consequences. A body that is not regularly pressing through its legs and spine does not maintain the same readiness for standing, walking, and impact bearing once gravity returns. Bone changes more slowly than fluid shifts or cardiovascular reflexes, but it participates in the same broader adaptation. The astronaut in space is becoming optimized for float rather than for weight-bearing. Muscles are part of this, but the skeleton is the deeper framework beneath them. Researchers understand many aspects of this process from station missions and earlier spaceflight, yet uncertainty remains in the details. Observations indicate that bone responds strongly to unloading, especially in the lower skeleton, and that recovery after return to Earth can take a long time. It also remains clear that duration matters greatly. A brief mission such as Artemis II does not produce the same degree of skeletal loss as months in orbit. What remains less certain is how individual susceptibility, exercise effectiveness, and mission-specific conditions combine in short, deep space flights beyond low Earth orbit. The direction of change is well established. The precise magnitude for each crew member must be measured after flight. By this stage, the body has already become altered in layered ways. The face may look fuller from fluid shift. Circulation may have reset to weightlessness. Muscles may be changing their pattern of use, and now the skeleton has begun its own response beneath them. Bone does not announce itself with sensation in the early phase. It changes silently, through cells responding to absent force and minerals moving according to revised needs. The Artemis II crew remains active, capable, and medically monitored. Yet inside the weightless cabin, the skeleton has already begun to hear a new message from the body's environment. There is less need to carry, less need to resist, and less reason to remain built in exactly the same terrestrial way. Within the floating body whose fluids, circulation, muscles, and bones have already begun to adapt, the systems of balance and vision now take on a special importance. On Earth, orientation depends on agreement among several streams of information. The eyes report where the horizon lies and how objects move across the visual field. The muscles and joints report the position of the limbs and trunk. The The skin reports pressure against the ground or a chair. Deep within the inner ear, tiny structures sense head movement and the pull of gravity. The brain compares all of these signals and forms a working sense of up, down, motion, stillness, and body position. In space, that agreement is disturbed. The body is still gathering information, but the information no longer fits together in the usual way. The inner ear contains the vestibular system, a set of structures that helps detect motion and orientation. Semicircular canals sense rotation of the head. Nearby organs called the otolith organs respond to linear acceleration and, on Earth, to the constant pull of gravity. The otoliths contain tiny crystals that shift with movement and with the downward force that is always present on the ground. In microgravity, this gravitational reference is largely removed. The crystals still respond to changes in motion, but they no longer provide the same steady information about which way is down. A major source of bodily certainty is therefore altered from the start of flight. This change produces a sensory conflict. A sensory conflict occurs when different information channels tell the brain different stories about the state of the body. The eyes may report that the cabin is still and orderly. The muscles may report that the limbs are relaxed and floating. The inner ear, however, is now operating without the familiar constant pull that once defined orientation. Movements that would be simple on Earth can produce unexpected sensations because the brain is applying Earth-trained interpretations to space-grown inputs. This is one of the reasons some astronauts experience space motion sickness, especially in the early phase of flight. Nausea, disorientation, headache, and a general sense of sensory mismatch can occur while the nervous system is learning new rules. The severity of this response varies. Some astronauts adapt quickly and experience only mild symptoms. Others may feel stronger effects for a time. The condition is not caused by weakness of character or by disease in the ordinary sense. It is a predictable consequence of taking a balance system evolved under gravity and placing it in a world where gravity no longer supplies a stable directional cue. The brain must gradually reweight the information it receives. Reweighting means giving more importance to some signals and less to others. In space, vision and touch often become more important guides, while the old gravitational meaning of vestibular signals is reduced. Vision therefore becomes both helpful and demanding. The eyes provide reference points that help the brain organize motion in the cabin. A wall, a handrail, a panel, or another crew member can all serve as visual anchors. At the same time, vision is working in a body whose internal fluids have shifted toward the head. This can subtly influence ocular comfort and perception. On longer missions, researchers have documented structural changes affecting the eye and nearby tissues in some astronauts, including flattening at the back of the eye, shifts in refraction, and changes in vision. These findings have been grouped under a broader syndrome related to spaceflight-associated neuroocular change. Observations indicate that this is a real concern in long-duration missions. It remains uncertain exactly which mechanisms dominate in each case, though fluid shifts, pressure changes, vascular factors, and individual susceptibility all appear relevant. On a short mission, lasting changes are less likely, but the immediate sensory environment still places vision under unusual demands. The eyes and the inner ear also work together in a reflex that stabilizes sight during head motion. This is the vestibulo-ocular reflex. It helps keep images steady on the retina by moving the eyes in response to head movement. On Earth, this reflex operates with extraordinary reliability. In microgravity, it remains functional, but the brain's interpretation of movement can shift because the vestibular inputs themselves are being recalibrated. During adaptation, head turns and body rotations may feel unfamiliar. A movement that would normally produce a simple sense of turning can instead bring a brief uncertainty about how the body is oriented in the cabin. With time, many astronauts learn to move more efficiently and with fewer symptoms as the nervous system settles into a new working model. Spatial sense in the cabin becomes less tied to vertical alignment and more tied to local task. A crew member may read a display while oriented sideways relative to another person, then rotate gently and continue working without any true need to define which wall is the floor. The brain can accommodate this flexibility, but it is still unusual compared with life on Earth. A stable environment with fixed walls becomes a place where any surface can serve as working orientation. This freedom can be useful, yet it also means that the body must create temporary frames of reference again and again. Vision helps establish them. Touch confirms them. The inner ear gradually stops insisting on the old ones. The sense of motion itself changes character. On Earth, acceleration is usually interpreted against gravity. A car turns, an elevator rises, a person leans, and the body compares all of this with the stable downward pull that remains in the background. In Orion, motion occurs without that same permanent reference. A gentle push can send the whole body drifting. Rotation can continue until stopped. Small unintended twists are more common because friction and weight no longer damp them in the old way. The sensory systems must learn to pass these motions with fewer automatic assumptions. As this learning progresses, the crew usually becomes more graceful in movement and less dependent on conscious correction. This adaptation is not merely about comfort. It has operational importance. The ability to orient the body, read instruments clearly, reach accurately, and avoid disorientation during tasks is essential in a spacecraft. For this reason, astronauts train extensively before flight, exposing themselves to simulations, unusual body positions, and operational routines that help prepare the nervous system. Training does not remove the effects of microgravity, but it provides a framework within which adaptation can occur more smoothly. The brain enters the mission with some expectation that its old rules will be challenged. By now, the Artemis II crew has spent days in an environment where up and down no longer govern posture, where the eyes have become primary guides, and where the inner ear has begun relinquishing its old certainty. Bodies already altered by space are altered here in a particularly intimate way, because balance and vision shape not only health, but perception itself. The astronauts do not merely float through the cabin, they inhabit a re-educated sensory world. The change is quiet and often hidden from outward view, yet it reaches deep into how the brain constructs place, motion, and self-position. In this region of adaptation, the body is no longer simply carrying out tasks in space. It is learning, moment by moment, how to know where it is without gravity. As the senses of balance and vision settle into their altered work, the body's internal timing systems continue their slower adjustment beneath the surface. Human physiology is organized not only by organs and tissues but by rhythms: sleep and wake, alertness and fatigue, hormone release, body temperature, appetite, digestion, and patterns of repair all follow daily cycles. These cycles are coordinated by the circadian rhythm, the internal timing system that runs on an approximately 24-hour pattern and is synchronized mainly by light. On Earth, the cycle is reinforced by sunrise, sunset, regular social timing, and the repeated structure of daily life within gravity and weather. Inside Orion, those familiar anchors are reduced. The body still keeps time, but it must do so in a smaller, more artificial environment. The most obvious expression of this system is sleep. Sleep in space is not simply the absence of work. It is a biological process that depends on timing signals, comfort, emotional steadiness, temperature, noise, posture, and light exposure through the day. In the spacecraft, the crew follows a planned schedule intended to stabilize rest and performance. Lighting is adjusted to support wakefulness during active periods and to support winding down during scheduled sleep. Even with this structure, sleep in space can feel different from sleep on Earth. The body's no longer lying under its own weight. There is no mattress pressing upward, no blanket settling naturally across the skin, no ordinary sense of left and right against a bed. Rest occurs while lightly restrained within a small volume, surrounded by airflow and the continuous soft activity of spacecraft systems. This unfamiliar physical context matters because the nervous system associates sleep with many subtle sensory conditions. On Earth, support from a bed, quiet shifts in room temperature, the dimming of evening light, and the reduction of external demands all help prepare the brain for sleep onset. In Orion, some of those cues must be recreated deliberately, and some cannot be recreated fully at all. The crew may sleep in darkness or dim light according to the mission plan, but the environment remains mechanically alive. Fans move air, equipment hums, ventilation continues across the face. The body must learn to interpret this steady artificial environment as compatible with rest. Many astronauts do so successfully, but research from spaceflight indicates that sleep duration and sleep quality can still be affected by confinement, workload, altered light exposure, and operational demands. The circadian system depends strongly on signals reaching the brain from the eyes. Light-sensitive cells in the retina help regulate the timing center in the brain, which in turn influences hormone release and many daily cycles. In space, the absence of a normal terrestrial day means that lighting inside the spacecraft takes on a regulatory role. When bright light appears at the right time, it helps promote alertness and supports alignment of the body clock. When light is dimmed and shifted toward warmer tones, it helps prepare the body for rest. This is not cosmetic lighting. It is physiological support. The daily pattern of illumination becomes part of life support in a broader sense because timing stability contributes directly to performance, mood, and recovery. Hormones are part of this timing network. Melatonin, a hormone associated with nighttime biological timing, usually rises in darkness and supports the onset of sleep. Cortisol, a hormone involved in alertness, metabolism, and stress response, usually follows a daily rhythm with higher levels around waking and lower levels later in the cycle. These hormones do not operate alone, but they help show how the body organizes itself in time. In a spacecraft, altered sleep patterns, unusual light exposure, emotional strain, and mission activity can all influence their timing and amplitude. The body is still rhythmic, but its rhythm may become shallower, shifted, or more dependent on schedule than on environment. Stress hormones deserve careful attention here because spaceflight is not only an environmental challenge, but also an operational one. Stress in physiology does not necessarily mean fear or panic. It means the activation of systems that help the body respond to challenge, uncertainty, and increased demand. A mission to lunar distance involves responsibility, confinement, complex procedures, altered sensation, and persistent awareness that survival depends on functioning systems. Even in calm and capable crews, this context can shape hormone release and autonomic regulation. The autonomic nervous system, which helps control heart rate, digestion, and other automatic functions, responds to both physical and psychological conditions. Changes in sleep, noise, workload, and circadian stability can therefore influence the body widely through these pathways. Body temperature is another quiet marker of circadian function. On Earth, temperature follows a daily cycle, usually dropping during the biological night and rising toward the day. This pattern interacts with sleep pressure and alertness. In a spacecraft, core temperature regulation continues, but the surrounding thermal environment is more controlled and less varied than most terrestrial settings. The body receives fewer natural thermal signals from outdoor air, sunlight through atmosphere, or ordinary shifts between indoor and outdoor life. This does not stop the rhythm, but it changes the environment in which the rhythm expresses itself. Scheduled activity, exercise, meals, and lighting become more important in reinforcing the timing of these cycles. Meals also serve as time signals. Eating patterns influence metabolism, hormone release, and digestive rhythms. In space, meals are scheduled partly for nutrition and partly for structure. The body benefits from predictable timing because many organs prepare for activity in anticipation of repeated daily events. The stomach, liver, pancreas, and intestines all participate in rhythms of digestion and energy use. When timing becomes irregular, these systems may feel the strain. On a short mission, the effects are usually manageable, but the principle remains clear. Time in biology is not abstract. It is carried through repeated acts such as waking, eating, exercising, working, and sleeping. Dreaming, mood, and subjective rest can also shift in confined flight. Research from space missions and other isolated environments indicates that sleep may become lighter or more fragmented under some conditions. Novel surroundings, unusual body sensations, anticipation of tasks, and cabin noise can all contribute. Individual responses vary. Some people adapt well and sleep efficiently once routine stabilizes. Others experience more interruption. Observations indicate that sleep in space is often adequate but not always optimal, and even modest reductions in sleep can influence attention, memory, emotional regulation, and perceived effort. This is one reason the management of light and schedule receives so much care in mission planning. By this stage of the journey, the Artemis II crew has already undergone visible and measurable changes in fluid balance, circulation, posture, muscle use, and sensory orientation. Now the body's inner clock is adapting as well, drawing order from artificial light, planned routine, and the repeated rhythms of cabin life. Sleep remains possible, hormones continue their cycles, and the nervous system preserves a working day and night. But the pattern is no longer being set by Earth in the old way. It is being maintained from within, supported by technology and discipline. Bodies already altered by space are altered here in time itself, not because the clock has stopped, but because the body must learn to keep its own midnight and morning inside a machine moving silently between worlds. Beneath the rhythms of sleep and waking, at a scale too small to feel directly, the body's cells and immune defenses continue responding to the space environment. These responses are quieter than fluid shifts and less visible than altered posture. Yet they are among the most important signs that the body has already changed. A cell is the basic living unit of the body, carrying out energy production, repair, signaling, and specialized work according to its tissue type. The immune system is the distributed network of cells, tissues, and molecules that helps the body distinguish self from threat, contain infection, clear damaged material, and regulate inflammation. In space, both of these systems remain active, but the conditions shaping them have changed. Radiation exposure is higher than on Earth. Stress physiology is altered. Sleep may be less stable, and microgravity affects how cells sense force and organize themselves. The result is not a single dramatic injury. It is a field of subtle biological responses unfolding together. Ionizing radiation is one of the clearest external influences at this level. Earlier, the outer environment of cislunar space is defined partly by radiation from solar activity and from galactic cosmic rays. At the scale of tissue and cells, this matters because ionizing radiation can damage molecules directly or indirectly by creating reactive chemical species, often called free radicals, that then damage other molecules. These effects can reach DNA, the hereditary material inside cells. DNA damage does not always lead to illness. Cells possess repair systems, and many injuries are corrected or contained, but radiation exposure increases the burden of repair and surveillance. The risk from a short mission is far lower than the risk from prolonged deep space travel. Yet the biological interaction begins immediately, because every passage of an energetic particle through tissue is an event at the cellular level. Most of these events are too small to notice individually. The body experiences them as part of a statistical pattern rather than a sensation. A single cell may repair damage successfully. Another may undergo programmed death if the injury is too great. A third may continue with altered signaling. Over time, the body's health depends on how well these responses remain coordinated, in a mission lasting about 10 days. The expected radiation dose is not high enough to cause acute radiation sickness under normal conditions. What matters instead is the cumulative influence of low to moderate exposure on tissues that are already adapting to microgravity and confinement. Observations from human spaceflight and related research indicate that even relatively short missions can produce measurable biological responses, though these are usually subtle and often reversible. Microgravity itself also shapes cellular behavior. Many cells are sensitive not only to chemicals and genes, but to force. They respond to tension, compression, fluid flow, and attachment to surrounding structures. On Earth, every tissue lives under gravity-shaped mechanical conditions. In space, those conditions are altered. Cells of muscle, bone, blood vessels, connective tissue, and the immune system all receive different mechanical signals than they do on the ground. This does not mean that every cell becomes unhealthy. It means that cells are interpreting a changed physical world and adjusting their behavior accordingly. Some genes become more active, others less active, depending on the tissue and the duration of exposure. Research has shown that gene expression, meaning the pattern by which genes are turned into functional products, can shift in spaceflight. These shifts vary with mission conditions and are not fully identical across individuals or cell types. The immune system is especially sensitive to this broader context. Immunity is not a single organ. It is a layered system including white blood cells, signaling molecules, lymphoid tissues, barrier surfaces, and the inflammatory responses that help the body react to injury or infection. In space, several influences converge on immune regulation. Sleep disruption can affect immune performance. Stress hormones can reshape inflammatory signaling. Radiation can influence immune cells directly. Microgravity can alter how immune cells move, communicate, and activate. Studies from astronauts and space-related experiments indicate that aspects of immune function can become dysregulated during spaceflight. Dysregulated means the system may become less balanced, with some responses reduced and others inappropriately heightened. This does not mean that astronauts become broadly defenseless. but it does mean that the normal fine-tuning of immunity may shift. One way this can appear is through changes in the activity of certain white blood cells. Their ability to respond to challenge, release signaling molecules, or proliferate may change under spaceflight conditions. Inflammation, which is the coordinated response to injury or potential threat, may also be altered. A healthy inflammatory response is neither too weak nor too strong. It must arrive when needed, remain controlled, and then subside. Spaceflight can influence this balance. Observations indicate that some markers of immune activation and stress can change during and after missions. It remains uncertain exactly how these changes interact in every short-duration deep space flight, because duration, mission design, diet, exercise, sleep, and individual physiology all matter. Still, the general pattern is well supported. The immune system does not remain entirely unchanged in space. Latent viruses provide one of the clearest examples of this altered immune balance. A latent virus is a virus that remains in the body in a quiet state after an earlier infection, normally kept under control by the immune system. In some astronauts, spaceflight has been associated with reactivation of certain latent herpes viruses, detected through viral shedding without necessarily causing overt illness. This finding suggests that immune regulation under flight conditions can loosen in subtle ways even when the astronaut feels generally well. For a mission as short as Artemis II, the clinical consequences may be minimal or absent, but the phenomenon shows how the body's hidden regulatory systems are already adjusting. Cells also face oxidative stress in this environment. Oxidative stress refers to an imbalance in which reactive molecules capable of damaging proteins, lipids, and DNA are produced faster than the body can neutralize them. Radiation can contribute to this, and so can altered metabolism and inflammation. The body has antioxidant systems to limit such damage, and these remain active during spaceflight. The issue is not that protection disappears. It is that the balance between damage and repair can shift. When this happens across many cells and tissues, even mildly, it becomes another way in which the body is already altered by space. Blood cells and vascular lining cells are part of this picture as well. The endothelium, the thin cellular lining inside blood vessels, helps regulate clotting, inflammation, vessel tone, and exchange between blood and tissues. Changes in fluid distribution, radiation exposure, and altered mechanical forces can all influence endothelial function. Red blood cells may also be affected over time. Some studies have suggested increased destruction of red blood cells in space, a process linked to space-associated anemia over longer durations. On a short mission, major anemia is not expected, but the line between immediate change and longer-term outcome begins at this cellular scale. The body is already moving in that direction even if the effect remains small. What makes this region of adaptation difficult to perceive is that the crew can look outwardly healthy, while many small adjustments are occurring within cells and immune pathways. The astronauts eat, work, sleep, communicate, and move through the cabin, and nothing in those ordinary acts reveals the molecular labor beneath them. DNA repair systems are working, immune signals are shifting, antioxidant defenses are engaging. Cells are reading mechanical cues that no longer match those of Earth. Space does not need to wound the body dramatically in order to change it. It changes it by presenting a new physical and radiative context to every living unit. By this point in the mission, the outer environment has been translated all the way inward. Vacuum becomes hull, hull becomes air becomes fluid shift becomes altered circulation becomes changed tissue use, and now the smallest living systems are responding in their own quiet way. The Artemis II crew returns not only with puffier faces or changed balance, but with cells and immune networks that have already begun the work of adaptation. What is known is that these responses are real and measurable. What remains uncertain, in each individual case, is exactly how far they progress on a short lunar mission and how quickly every system returns to its terrestrial pattern after landing. After days of adaptation to weightlessness, the return to Earth begins with a reversal that is both mechanical and biological. The spacecraft leaves the deep space portion of its path and commits itself to descent, bringing the crew back toward the atmosphere and toward the force that has been absent from their bodies throughout the mission. Gravity has never vanished from the wider system, but now it begins again to make itself felt in a direct human way. This return is not a simple restoration of the old condition. The body that re-enters Earth's environment is no longer the body that launched. Its fluids have shifted, its circulation has reset, its muscles have changed their pattern of use, its bones have already begun receiving different signals, and its sensory systems have learned to function without a stable down. Re-entry places all of these adaptations under sudden new demands. The descent itself is a sequence of controlled exposure to increasing physical force. As Orion approaches Earth, it meets the upper layers of the atmosphere at very high speed. The air at those altitudes is still thin, but the spacecraft is moving so quickly that the gas in front of it is compressed and heated intensely. The crew inside does not feel the heat directly, because the heat shield and the structure of the spacecraft carry that burden. What they do feel is the return of acceleration. Acceleration is the rate at which velocity changes. In everyday life on Earth, its effects are often modest and brief. During re-entry, the body is once again pressed into the seat by forces that have a clear direction. Weight, absent for so many days, begins to reappear as pressure. This change is important because the cardiovascular system has been living without the need to support a tall vertical blood column. During spaceflight, central fluid shift and later reduction in plasma volume help the body operate in microgravity. As gravity returns, that same adapted state can become a problem. Blood is once again encouraged to move downward toward the lower body. The vessels and reflexes that normally defend blood pressure during upright posture must become active again. But they are reawakening after days of altered use. The heart must fill and pump under a different geometry. Blood pressure regulation becomes newly demanding. Even while still strapped into the spacecraft, the crew may begin experiencing the internal challenge of returning to a world where fluids once again have a lower destination. The sensory systems face an equally abrupt reversal. The inner ear, which has spent days learning not to rely on gravity as a stable reference, now receives that pull again. The otolith organs once more feel a persistent directional load. Visual cues change as well. The window no longer frames the distant stillness of space and the complete disk of Earth. Instead, brightness, plasma glow during the hottest phase, motion, and changing orientation give the nervous system a much denser stream of information. A body that has adapted to free-floating movement and cabin-based frames of reference must suddenly work again with acceleration, directional loading, and the expectation that down has become real. Motion sickness can reappear at this stage, not because the body has failed to adapt in space, but because it must now adapt back. Breathing remains possible and carefully supported, yet the physical feeling of breathing may also change. The chest is pressed differently against the seat. The abdominal organs again have direction and weight. The respiratory muscles work in a context that more closely resembles Earth. But the transition is not seamless. The body is moving from one stable operating mode into another through a brief period of mechanical stress. Blood gases remain regulated, but the whole act of breathing is being reintroduced to load, pressure on the body, vibration, and the awareness of descent can make this experience more noticeable than it has been during the quiet drift of the mission. The return of load also affects muscles and joints. Throughout the flight, the body has moved in a world where floating replaces standing. Now straps, seats, and acceleration define posture again. The neck must support the head under renewed effective weight. The trunk is pressed into restraint systems. Limbs once more feel the directional pull of mass. These effects are especially noticeable because the muscular system has already begun to reduce some of its postural activity in space. The re-entry couch and body position are designed to help distribute these forces safely, but the body still experiences them as the return of a familiar burden after a period of release. Thermal protection, parachute deployment, and final descent are engineering events, yet they are also part of the body's return sequence because each stage changes motion and sensation. As the spacecraft slows, the pattern of force shifts. Deceleration gives way to a different rhythm of descent. The opening of parachutes introduces its own mechanical transitions, with changes in pull and vibration that the body must absorb. By the time the capsule approaches the ocean, the astronauts have already passed through several distinct physical states in a relatively short span. The nervous system, cardiovascular system, and musculoskeletal system have all been asked to recover Earth-based function while still inside a moving vehicle. Splashdown completes the transition in a visible way, though not in a biological sense. The spacecraft meets the ocean surface, and the crew is once again on Earth, yet the body is still in the early phase of readaptation. Gravity is fully present now, but the systems that respond to it may lag behind. Standing immediately after return can be difficult for astronauts after even moderate durations in space, because blood pressure control, balance, coordination, and muscle use are not instantly restored. On a mission of about 10 days, recovery is usually faster than after long orbital stays, but the challenges are still real. The body has to remember how to distribute blood downward without starving the brain, how to trust the inner ear again, and how to let the legs and trunk resume their old responsibilities. This is why medical teams pay such close attention in the first hours after landing. The crew may feel weak, unsteady, nauseated, or simply unusual in ways that reflect normal readaptation rather than injury. Orthostatic intolerance, the difficulty in maintaining blood pressure when upright, can appear because the body's fluid volume is reduced and its reflexes have not fully resumed terrestrial strength. Balance may feel unreliable because the brain is once again sorting vestibular signals that have regained gravity. The sense of heaviness in arms, head, and torso may itself feel strange after days of floating. Even the act of turning the head can carry a sensation that no longer matches what the body has grown used to. In this region of the journey, the changes caused by space are no longer hidden entirely inside the body. Re-entry reveals them by confronting the astronaut with gravity again. What was efficient in orbit becomes a challenge on Earth. Reduced fluid volume, altered cardiovascular reflexes, loosened postural habits, and recalibrated sensory systems all become evident in the return phase. The crew comes home within a strong spacecraft and under close support. But their bodies are not simply resuming where they left off. They're crossing a threshold between two physical worlds, and at splashdown they arrive on Earth carrying within them the exact record of having lived elsewhere. Once the capsule is recovered and the crew is brought into medical care, the changes that began quietly in cislunar space are examined in a more measured way. Spaceflight medicine does not look only for injury. It looks for adaptation, for the small and layered ways in which the body has adjusted to a different physical world. The Artemis II crew returns after a mission short enough to avoid many of the deeper losses associated with long stays in orbit, yet long enough for multiple systems to have shifted from their terrestrial baseline. The visible signs may be subtle at first. Faces may still appear slightly full or tired. Movements may seem careful. Posture may be less steady than usual. Behind these outward impressions, clinicians begin collecting data that reveal how quickly the body has already changed and how it begins to change back. The first measurements often concern circulation and hydration. Heart rate and blood pressure are checked in different body positions to see how well the cardiovascular system handles gravity again. A person who feels well while reclining may become lightheaded when sitting or standing because blood is now being drawn downward and the body's reflexes are still catching up. This is one way orthostatic intolerance becomes visible. It does not necessarily indicate illness in the usual sense. It reflects the fact that the body has spent days operating without the need to defend upright blood pressure. Reduced plasma volume, altered vessel tone, and changes in cardiac filling all contribute. Medical teams therefore pay close attention to how well the crew tolerates simple postural changes, because these responses show how far the cardiovascular system has adapted to space and how quickly it can readapt to Earth. Body mass and fluid status also matter. Some weight change may reflect shifts in hydration, food intake, and the complex rearrangement of fluids that occurs during flight and return. Laboratory tests can assess blood chemistry, electrolyte balance, and markers linked to fluid regulation. Urine studies may provide information about hydration and mineral handling, including calcium excretion, which can reflect the early skeletal response to unloading in a short mission. These changes are expected to be mild compared with those seen after longer exposure, but they still form part of the post-flight picture. The point is not merely to confirm that the crew is safe, it is to understand the body's trajectory through adaptation and recovery. Balance and coordination are examined because they often reveal spaceflight effects clearly. The crew has spent days relying less on gravity-based vestibular cues and more on vision and touch. After landing, the nervous system must once again trust the inner ear as a constant source of down. Tests may include standing stability, walking patterns, head movement tolerance, and eye movement assessment. A person may be able to think clearly and speak normally while still feeling unsteady on the feet. This shows that sensory readaptation is not simply a matter of will. The brain needs time to reintegrate visual, vestibular, and proprioceptive information under gravity. Proprioception is the sense of body position generated by muscles and joints. In microgravity, that sense has been recalibrated within a floating body. On Earth, it must again support standing and locomotion. Muscle performance is assessed in similar detail. Strength testing, functional movement assessment, and observation of posture can show how even a brief mission has altered muscle use. The greatest concerns usually relate to the lower limbs and trunk, because these regions lose the most continuous loading in space. After only about 10 days, large losses in strength are not expected, but subtle reductions in endurance, stability, and automatic postural control may already be present. A crew member may notice heaviness in the legs, stiffness through the back, or an unusual awareness of body weight during ordinary motion. These experiences are medically meaningful because they demonstrate how quickly the body shifts away from the effortless support that gravity once required. The eyes and visual system are also part of the medical picture. Post-flight examination can look for changes in visual acuity, eye structure, and symptoms such as blurring, pressure sensation, or altered focus. short missions are less likely to produce the more pronounced neuroocular findings associated with long-duration flight. Yet visual assessment remains important because fluid shifts and sensory adaptation begin immediately in space. Even small changes help researchers understand how individual physiology responds to lunar distance missions. What is known from prior astronaut research is that the eyes can participate in space adaptation. What remains uncertain in short, deep space flights is how consistently subtle changes appear, how they interact with mission conditions, and how quickly they resolve after return. Blood analysis can offer another layer of insight. Markers of inflammation, stress hormones, immune cell counts, and metabolic indicators may shift with spaceflight and readaptation. These measures help show whether the immune system has been pushed toward a different regulatory state and whether the body is mounting a return toward its terrestrial baseline. Spaceflight does not usually leave a simple signature in blood that says one thing alone. Instead, it creates a pattern. Hormones linked to stress and circadian timing may be altered. Immune signaling may show modest shifts. Oxidative stress markers may reflect the combined burden of radiation, confinement, and physiological change. In a mission as brief as Artemis II, the pattern is expected to be subtle, but subtle does not mean unimportant. It is precisely these modest, early shifts that matter when planning future longer journeys. Medical imaging and other technical measurements may extend the picture further. Bone density changes over 10 days are usually too small to transform the skeleton in an obvious way. Yet early signs of altered bone turnover may still be detectable through biochemical markers rather than through large structural loss. Cardiac imaging can show how the heart is functioning after flight. Body composition tools may help separate fluid changes from tissue changes. Neurovestibular testing can quantify balance readaptation more precisely than casual observation. Each of these methods turns the astronaut's return into a scientific record of adaptation, not only a homecoming. Recovery after such a mission is generally expected to be relatively rapid compared with recovery after months in orbit. Many functions improve over hours to days, while some subtler measures may continue normalizing over longer periods. This pattern reflects both the resilience of the human body and the brevity of the mission. Yet the phrase "bodies already altered by space" remains accurate because the changes begin early, involve many systems, and can be measured soon after landing. The body does not wait for long-duration exploration before it starts adjusting. It begins as soon as gravity is removed and continues until gravity returns, then begins again in reverse. For Artemis II, these medical findings carry importance beyond the crew themselves. They help define what short missions beyond low Earth orbit do to human physiology under modern mission conditions. They connect the legacy of lunar distance flight with present-day plans for longer exploration. Observations indicate that even brief deep space missions can produce real changes in fluid balance, cardiovascular regulation, sensory orientation, muscle use, immune activity, and perhaps early skeletal and visual responses. It remains uncertain, for each future mission profile, how these changes will combine and whether some individuals will prove more susceptible than others. This is why post-flight medicine is both care and inquiry. In the recovery area, away from vacuum and radiation and the hard light of cislunar space, the evidence of the mission settles into data, symptoms, and measured return of function. The astronauts sit, stand, walk, rest, and undergo examinations while gravity slowly reclaims its ordinary authority over blood, balance, and posture. Their bodies carry no visible mark that fully explains where they have been, yet within them are the traces of a different environment written into fluids, cells, reflexes, and tissues. The mission ends in the ocean and on the recovery deck. But the physiological story continues in this careful medical reading of what space has already changed. The body settles again under Earth's gravity, and the many small adjustments of the mission begin their return toward older patterns. Blood gradually resumes its familiar downward distribution. The heart and vessels relearn the ordinary challenge of keeping pressure steady from chest to brain while the body stands and walks. The inner ear, once freed from the constant pull that shaped it on Earth, slowly restores that pull to the center of the orientation. Muscles that had grown used to floating begin once more to support weight without being asked. Bones continue their quiet exchange of breakdown and renewal, now hearing again the steady instruction of load. None of this happens in a single moment. Recovery is not a switch, but a gentle correction, one system at a time. The visible signs may fade quickly. A face becomes less full, a step becomes steadier, a head turn feels simpler. Yet the deeper return continues beyond what the eye can see. Cells keep repairing, hormones continue finding their rhythm, and sleep gradually reconnects with a planet that offers morning and evening without effort. The body remembers Earth because it was shaped by Earth. But for a short time it has also learned another condition, and that lesson does not vanish all at once. What remains after such a mission is not only data or medical observation. There is also the clear biological fact that space begins to alter the body almost at once, even over a journey measured in days rather than months. The change is real, orderly, and understandable. It moves from environment to vessel, from vessel to air, from air to circulation, and from circulation inward to tissue and cell. Then, on return, it begins the same long path in reverse, toward the familiar ground.